Hey, and welcome to the JavaScript Games course, in which you will learn how to build 7 awesome grid-based games. Coding to build tangible projects is definitely by far the easiest way to learn any language. This is why I've chosen 7 easy grid-based games, going from easiest to hardest, to help us all become pros at JavaScript. Not to mention, you're going to have a pretty cool portfolio full of stuff by the end of this tutorial. These games from easiest to hardest are Memory Game, Whack-A-Mole, Connect 4, Nokia 3310 Snake, Space Invaders, Frogger, and Tetris. I think my favourite game is definitely Tetris. What I would suggest is that you do each game from the easiest to the hardest. Don't just jump in the middle and start with, I don't know, Frogger. This is because I'm going to be covering functions at the beginning, for example, query selector, that we're going to use in literally every single game, but I'm not going to go into detail about it in any tutorial after the one that we cover it in. So if you start us at the end, you're literally going to not know, well, the majority of the inbuilt functions we're going to be talking about. I'm going to be incorporating as many inbuilt JavaScript functions as I possibly can, so by the end of this course you should be pretty confident using all of them. If you want a full list of the inbuilt functions we're going to cover, please do look below. I'm going to include that in the description along with the games that we're going to cover. As always, I'm going to go with bare minimum styling. This is so that you can take the project and make it your own. So let's get going. Okay, so the first game we're going to make is Memory Game. Memory Game is a simple grid-based game in which you as the player have to flip over 2 cards. If the 2 cards match, that's 1 point for you, and also the cards get taken off the board, leaving with you with the remainder of the cards that you then also have to flip over. The game is finished when you've flipped over all the cards. No one really knows the origin of the Memory Game, and trust me, I've done my fair share of internet stalking to try and find out. What I can tell you is that it's been renamed, flipped over, made variations of. Just in English alone, it's called Concentration Game, Match, Match-Up Memory, Palmanism, or simply Pairs. We are going to be coding a game of Memory Game in order to get our heads around working with empty arrays, as well as pushing and storing things in them. Other things we're going to cover are the inbuilt JavaScript functions setAttribute, getAttribute, createElement, appendChild, mathRandom, sort, and working with loops. As always, simple styling for you to take and make your own. So let's set up our folder to have our app.js file, index.html file, style CSS file in the root, along with an images folder for all the images we are going to use. Please make sure to have the images as 100 pixel by 100 pixel squares to avoid us stretching and tampering with them later. After saving your images, simply drag and drop them into your folder. I have chosen to go for 6 fast foods, a blank for when my card is on its front, and a white PNG file to simulate the board space being empty. Now, in our HTML boilerplate, we need to put a h3 tag in the body along with a span of ID result. Our live score will show up in here. Next, we create a div with the class name of grid. This is where our game grid will be created. Don't forget to link up your star CSS file and app.js file with these tags. Now flip over to your CSS file and add some styling to your grid. Because our cards are 100 pixels by 100 pixels, we will be able to make a 3 by 4 square grid. Now flip over to your app.js file. All our JavaScript code will be done in this DOM event listener from now on. Let's start by making an array of cards and giving them names that we will use later. I'm going to make 2 of each, as we need 2 of each card in our array to play the game. You will see here that I am simply naming the card, and for the image I'm writing the relative path to each image. Okay, now we're going to create our game board. First, using Query Selector, I'm going to pick out the element with the class name of grid from my HTML and define it as grid for our JavaScript. Now, using a for loop, I'm going to loop over my card array, and for each card I'm going to create an image element. I'm going to call this element card. For each card I'm going to set as an attribute, linking it to the image with relative path image, blank, PNG. I'm also going to give each one a data ID and loop over each one to give them an ID that goes from 0 to 11, as we have 12 cards in total in our card array. We will then add an event listener to listen out to if the cards have been clicked on, and invoke a flip card function. I will comment this out for now as we have not written this function quite yet. Finally, all these cards, or technically image elements with different IDs we've created, we're going to put into the div with a class name of grid using append child. Now let's invoke the function and flip over to our browser. And done, let's carry on. So to make our game work, we need to do two more things: check for matched and flip your card. Let's start by writing flip card as we saw in our function above. Let's set a variable of card ID. In this, we are simply getting the data ID attribute we created in the create board function above. We will now make an empty array of cards chosen. Using push, we will push the cards from the card array based on that card ID. So if the card ID is 4, this will match the 5th card in our card array. Once we have located this card, we will get its name. We are going to do the same to push the card ID in a separate, for now empty, array. For this one, we just want the ID. Now, because flip card is already in a function, we technically already have a card picked. This set attribute will let us add an image to that square based on the card ID it holds. We only want to put 2 cards in our cards chosen array. So with this if statement, we are saying that if the cards chosen array is equal to 2, we want to invoke the function for check for match. This set timeout will give us some buffer time so the whole thing doesn't happen too quickly. I want to check for a match after exactly 500 milliseconds. Okay, now let's write the check for match function. Let's pick out all the images that we created in our first function using query selector all and call them cards. Now we have 2 values in our cards chosen array as well as our cards chosen ID array at this point. Let's use both the values here like this and set them as const. By writing cards chosen ID and then a 0 in square brackets, I am saying I want the first value in my array and I want to assign it to the constant option 1 ID. Do the same for the second value. Using the same logic but for cards chosen, so the names rather than the IDs, I'm going to check that the first item in my array deeply equals the second item in my cards chosen array. If the answer is true, I want an alert to pop up, and I want to assign both of them a white PNG for styling. I also want to make another empty array called cards1 and push the 2 chosen cards into that array to be stored. If the cards don't match, I want to flip the card back over to be played again, so visually giving them a blank PNG and send an alert. Either way, if either of these two things happen, I still want to clear the cards chosen array and the cards chosen ID array, ready to start flipping again. So now we are collecting cards 1. It would be cool to convert this into a score and display this to the user via the browser. By picking out the span element with the ID result from our HTML, we can do this using text content. We can pass through exactly how many times we have stored something in our cards1 array, so 1 point for every match. If the cards1 deeply equal the length of our cards array divided by 2, we know we have collected all the possible cards in our cards array. Let's alert the user of this via the browser, like this. Now, the final thing that will allow us to refresh the game with new card positions is to randomize our card array. Let's do this using sort and math random. And there you have it, your very own memory game. Again, I've not gone to town on styling simply because otherwise we would be here for way too long. But please have a go yourself. Comment below if you have any questions, and yeah, let me know if you have any other ideas for games I can make. I'm all ears. Thanks. So hopefully by now you have your own working game of memory game, as well as a strong grasp of query selectors and event listeners. We are going to be using them again today to build your very own game of whack-a-mole. We will also be using class list, add, remove, for each, and arrow functions. As this game is going to be timed with you getting 60 seconds to bash the mole as many times as possible, we're also going to be introducing set interval and clear interval for this game. Whack-a-mole is a simple grid-based game in which you, as the user, have to whack the mole as many times as possible in 60 seconds. Whack-a-mole is a game invented in 1975 by Kazuo Yamada. He clearly saw a gap in the market for bashing moles with massive mallets, and judging by the popularity of this game today, he was right. As always, we're going to do simple styling for you to take and make your own. Okay, to start our project, let's first make sure we have the right files in our folder. You can see here I already have made an index.html file, app.js file, and style sheet called style CSS. As you can see, I've gone ahead and set out our HTML for the project. The first thing we need to do is see that our HTML boilerplate, I have added a link to our CSS file right here on line 6. I have also made sure to add a script tag to talk to our JavaScript file. You can see this on line 31. We also have some H2 headers with IDs, one for score and one for time left. I have also gone ahead and added a div with the class name of grid with 9 divs inside. Each div has a unique ID that we will use later, as well as a general class name of square. We will be using these class names and IDs for our JavaScript file and CSS file to communicate with our HTML page. So now let's flip over to our CSS file in order to render our divs into a visual grid in the browser. Using .square, I am looking for class names called square in our HTML file. This is what dot essentially means, class name. I am giving them each 200 pixel width and height, as well as some additional styling. Feel free to go wild with your own colors, border styles, and fills. If you save the file and open up your browser by right-clicking the index.html file, this is what you should see. 9 divs we just styled stacked on top of each other. Using class name grid, we will now make sure these squares are put into a grid shape. We will do this by using display flex and flex flow to make our divs stack left to right and stack over each other, whilst being entered and constrained into a height and width of the overall grid. Let's go back to our browser and refresh. And this is now what we see. For the mole class name, I'm going to show you how to add an image to a div. Type the following like so, then drop the JPEG file into your project. You will see it on the left as mole.jpg. Then simply type the path name into your background image style. Now let's see if that has worked by hard coding it into our HTML. And it has. Perfect. Right, now on to writing our JavaScript and making our game work. We will start by selecting all the divs with class name of square from our HTML file and calling them square for our JavaScript file and our future use in it. We will do the same for divs with the class name of mole. And also for time left, using query selector to find the ID of time left, shown here as an ID by using the hash as opposed to a dot for class names. Again, we do the same for score and use a let, as this will change as we progress in the game. To start the game, let's set result as 0 and get to writing our first function of randomly selecting a square on our grid. We will start, as with all grid-based games, by removing any class from divs. This is done so there are no seemingly left behind divs with styling on our board. Using an arrow function and for each, we remove the class name of mole from all of our squares in the grid. Now we define a random position on our grid by using math_random. And then we multiply it by the numbers of squares we have in the grid. We use math_floor to round down to the nearest integer so that the random position is always under or equivalent to 9. Once the random position is defined, we add the class of mole to it so that the mole appears in the grid. Next, we pass on the random position's ID to our hit position. We need this to use later in our code. So, for example, if the ID of the position from our HTML is 4, this will now be our hit position. We will now use an arrow function for each and an event listener to write if statements. The event listener of mouse up refers to when we hit our mouse on an element. On this occasion, it means if we hit with our mouse and the ID of that div equals our hit position, we win. And we add 1 point to our result. We then use text content to visually display that result in the browser. Now, we need to write a function that will move the mole every so often. We can set this time interval ourselves. We start by setting the timer ID as null, then using setInterval to make the function random square run every 1000 milliseconds. You can obviously change this to whatever time you want. Let's invoke this function like so and see it in action. Great, now let's remove that function to uninvoke it and get to writing how much time we have left in the game for that extra suspense. Let's scroll to the top and let current time be the inner context of the header2 with ID time left. Now let's write our countdown function. This function will make our current time go down by 1 incrementally. Show this new time in the browser, and if the current time reaches 0, we have a game over. We clear the time interval and set an alert to let the user know that the game is over and their final result. Finally, using setInterval, we pass through the countdown function, make it evoke every 1 second, and there you have it, Whac-A-Mole. Hi and welcome back to the JavaScript Games course. In this tutorial we're going to be coding Connect 4 as well as focusing on on-click events for this game. If you haven't watched the two previous tutorials before this, I strongly recommend you do. We're going to be using things like query selectors and event listeners that we did cover in the previous ones, so if you're not comfortable with them, please watch those videos before attempting this one. As always, we're going to do simple styling. This is so that you can get the project, make it your own. So I'm literally going to be focusing maybe like max 5 minutes on the style sheet. Connect 4 is a simple grid-based game in which you as the user have to drop a chip down into one of the columns to take your place. After you've taken your place, the second player will take their turn. Please bear in mind for this game, obviously we can't really have gravity, so we're just going to use the bottom grid as the bottom grid, meaning that if you want to put a chip in a space that doesn't have a chip below it, you're not going to be able to, right? So the point of the game is to get 4 in a row. This is either in a column or row, but also diagonally. The first player to do this wins. Okay, so let's get going. Okay, so first let's set up our project with the correct files in our folder. We will have the app.js for our JavaScript, index.html for our HTML code, and style CSS for our CSS styling. In your HTML file, add a div with the class name grid with enough divs inside to make a 7x6 grid, so 42 divs. We also need to add 7 more divs to the bottom with the class name taken. This will be the bottom of our grid. Add a span with the ID current player so we can display the current player to the user, like this. And also one for result so we can see who wins in the event of a win. Always make sure to link your style sheet and JavaScript file in the HTML file. Okay, now flip over to your CSS file and add the following styling to make our list of divs and the div with the class name grid look like an actual grid. We use Flexbox to wrap the divs into a grid square. We will also be passing our player 1 and player 2 colors here. Like this. Okay, now flip over to your JavaScript file and add a DOM event listener like this. All your JavaScript code will be done in the event listener from now on. Okay, so the first thing we are going to do is write a function that will listen out for every time we click a square in our grid. We will start off by writing a loop to loop over each square, then a function to add an on click to it. Now let's write some if statements. So what we are writing here is that if you click on a div and the div below it, or 7 squares down, has a class name of taken, you are allowed to click on this div and claim it as your take and go. Right, so if you can go and if you are player 1, add a class name of taken to that square. Also add a class name of player 1 to that square so we can visually see where you have chosen to place your go in the browser. Now do the same for player 2. If you aren't in a square that is one up from one with the class name taken, an alert saying you can't go here will pop up. Now let's open our browser to see if this works. Okay, great. Now let's check the board for a win or lose with a checkboard function. First, we need to declare what a winning combination actually is on our board. I actually found these somewhere online, so I have cheated and I'm passing this on to you so we don't have to figure this out ourselves, otherwise we'll be here all day. Okay, now again using a loop, we are essentially plugging in values to the squares on our grid. This is so we can check if these squares are in a winning array and also contain the class name player1. If the answer is true, we want to display player1 wins in the inner HTML of the span with ID result on our HTML page. Okay, do the same for player2 like this. Finally, on each click of the squares in our grid, we want to add an event listener and pass through the checkboard function. This means the function will run every time you press on a square in the div grid. Okay, there you have it. Thanks for listening. If you have any questions, please do let me know. Welcome back to the JavaScript Games course. Today we're going to be teaching you how to make your own Nokia 3310 Snake. For those of you who have never owned a Nokia 3310, Snake is a simple grid-based game in which the snake, or array, is going to be chasing a little apple on the screen. So you're going to be controlling the snake. It's been going like this. It's going to be on a timer, obviously. It's going to keep going, so you're just going to control it. And once it gets the apple, it's going to give you points, but it's also going to speed up in time. So that's going to be quite cool to build. We're going to be using a lot of set intervals and clear intervals as well for this game. We are now on game 4 out of 7 of this course. In this game, you're going to be learning how to use key codes, which are really cool. I'll talk about them later, as well as pop, unshift, push, and going over functions that we've previously learned in the 4 previous games. So key codes are pretty awesome. A key code is literally the code associated with the ones on your keyboard. So for example, if I want to say start the game by pressing, I don't know, the G on your keyboard, we can do that. That's pretty cool. I'm going to be going into that in a lot more detail in the game along with switch cases. So if you're interested in that, please start my video and let's get going. To start our project, let's first make sure we have the right files in our folder. You can see here I've already made an index, HTML file, app.js file, and style sheet called style CSS. The first thing we need to do is set our HTML template, making sure to add the following script tag to talk to our JavaScript file. Next, we need to add a link to our CSS file like so. I'm going to go ahead and add a button tag with a class name of start to our HTML file. This class name will allow us to pick out the specific element later in our JavaScript file. I am now going to add a div with a class name score to it for the same purpose. Once we have written our JavaScript code, the score of our game will appear between the two span tags here and overwrite the 0 I am writing now. Now let's make our grid. Now to make the grid, we need to decide how many squares a snake game should have. This is totally up to you. You can make the game as big, small or awkward as you want. For the sake of ease, I'm going to make my grid 10 by 10 squares, meaning I need a total of 100 squares. Now let's make our grid actually look like a grid by flipping over to our style sheet and adding some stuff. Using .grid, I am looking for a class name called grid. This is what the dot essentially means, class name. I'm going to make my grid 200 pixels by 200 pixels and make sure the divs fit into this grid by using display flex and flex wrap. Now we're going to give each of the divs in our grid a height and width of 20 pixels. This is simply so that they fit into our 200 by 200 pixel grid, making sure there's only 10 of them each way. Now let's add a snake class and make it blue. Flip back to the HTML file and hardcode it in here just so we can see how that will look. And voila, any div with a class name of snake now will be blue. Let's do the same for apple. Now let's get to writing some JavaScript and making our game work. Add an event listener like so. From now on, all our code will be in this event listener. Now we need to pick up the elements from our HTML file by class name, as I mentioned before. For this, we will use document query selectors. What we are telling the file to do is select all the divs in the div with class name of grid and call them squares for the file. We will also select the span element and call it the score display and select the button with the class name of start. Note the dot here is for class name and call it start button. Now we just need to set the width so our JavaScript file knows, as we have not told it yet. Our current index, so the first div in our grid, it is important to know that by writing 0, we mean it's the first, item or element. It's just how the computer starts counting when there's arrays involved. So now let's set up our Apple index at 0 for the time being. Now let's draw our snake. As you can imagine, we will need to differentiate between what is the head and what is the tail. From now on, all divs that have a value of 2 will be the head, and all divs with a value of 0 will be the tail. For body parts, we will use ones, and this array will now be our snake. Direction we're going to state as 1, meaning that the snake should always go one div down the array, i.e. right. And then we need to state the score, speed, interval time, and interval. Okay, now let's make our snake move across the board using key codes. Each key on your keyboard has a key code assigned to it. We will write a function called control and pass through E for event in order to make our snake move up and down, left or right, depending on what key you press on your keyboard. We will first make sure how to remove all class list of snake between each move. This will take a split second, but will prevent our snake from appearing to be left behind. Now we will write an if statement stating if we press the right arrow button on our keyboard, the snake will go right, or in other words, down one space in our grid array. Now let's do the same for the up arrow, making sure our snake goes into the 10th position back from its current position in the array, as this is what we set our width to. The result of this is that snake will appear to move up one whole row. Now let's finish off by writing the same for the left arrow button and the down arrow button. Finally, let's add an event listener for every time a key is pressed to execute the function control. Now we have assigned key codes to our snake movements, let's write a function to start the game and make our snake move at a certain speed around our grid. Using an arrow function, we are going to make sure that each index of the current snake array is taken into consideration. We do this using for each. Then we remove all class names of snake from the divs the current snake array is currently in. At the start of this function, there is no class name of snake in any of the divs in our current snake array. We also remove the apple class, like so, from the div that is the apple index. What I am doing here is essentially resetting everything, the interval, the score, everything. Once it's reset, we are going to randomly generate an apple. We will write this function later. Now we write what we want to happen when we start the game. So direction is to equal 1 for the snake to go right. We set an interval time, we define our snake, give it a start position, and add class names to the divs the snake array is currently in. Now we need to pass through the interval time and a function we will write called moveOutcomes. This function will deal with any and all outcomes for our decisions to move the snake. It will deal with collisions, wins, and score setting. Let's plan for what the snake needs to do by writing out like so. To deal with the snake hitting a border or itself, we are going to write an if statement in our moveOutcomes function. First of all, it's important to see that we are dealing with the snake's head at the moment, and we are using width to figure out where on the grid the snake head is. We need to do this to figure out when the snake head is in any of the squares at the bottom of our grid, or indicated by the two parallel lines, or on the right side of our grid, and so on. Our last statement is an if statement for if the snake goes into itself. Oops, we need another or here. Right, so if any of the above happen, the following is returned. We clear the interval. Now we need to define what exactly is the tail. We do so by writing this constant and using pop. Now let's remove the class name of snake from the tail and give a direction to just the head of the snake. Let's deal with what happens when the head of the current snake gets into a square that contains a class name apple with an if statement. Once again, we start with removing the apple class name for a clean slate, then adding a class to the newly added tail of the snake, making it appear to grow longer. Again, we will add our random apple function here when we write it to generate a new apple once this one is gone and add one to the score. Now let's display that new score in the inner HTML of our score display and clear the interval time. Finally, let's multiply the new interval time by the speed. As our speed is 0.9, this will decrease the interval time each time this is updated. Lastly, let's reset the interval and close the if statement. Let's not forget to re-add the class name of snake at the end of our moveOutcomes function. Right then, we've been coding for a while. Let's see if this works so far. We have written a start game function, so now let's link it to the start button on our HTML page with an event listener. So on click of the start button, we want to invoke the start game function. And it works. For some reason the left arrow button is not working. And here is why we are missing an equals sign. Oops. Okay, now finally let's address that generate random apple function we have been talking about. So here we go. We use mathRandom to generate a random number based on the square's length. This means the apple can pop up anywhere on our grid. We use mathfloor to round down the number to the nearest integer to make sure the random square is below or including the 100th square. We will use while to make sure that the apple does not appear in any div that already has a class name snake. And that's it. Let's read the Let's re-add the commented out random apple function in our code. Let's get rid of the hard-coded classes in our HTML. And there we go. We now have a fully functioning game of Snake. Hey, welcome back. We are currently at game 5 out of 7 of the JavaScript Games course. In this tutorial, we're going to be learning how to build Space Invaders, another JavaScript, HTML, and CSS grid-based game. By building Space Invaders, we're going to be concentrating on the switch case. This is going to be massive throughout the whole game, so if you're interested in learning more about the switch case, please watch this video. Space Invaders is really simple. You're going to be a user or shooter that moves along from one side of the grid to the other in a 15 by 15 grid square. Your goal is to shoot all the little invaders, so all the little ones coming down, they're going to be doing like this before they get to you. So technically it is a time game. There's not so much of a countdown, but obviously the invaders moving down is a countdown in itself. This means we are going to be using a lot of set interval and clear interval too. As always, minimal styling for you to take and make your own. So yeah, let's get going. So as always, let's make sure to link up your style CSS file with a link tag and app.js file with a script tag in your HTML file. Let's start off by adding an h3 tag where we can display our score. Let's add a span with an ID of result here so we can display the score as well as play our game. Next, let's add a div with a class name of grid. In it, we will put 11 by 11. Actually, let's make it bigger. Let's make it 15 by 15 squares for our game. So a total of 225 divs that we will style as squares in our style CSS file. Let's flip over to that now. Let's apply some styling to our grid to make it look like an actual grid, as well as the grid divs inside of it. We are using a width and a height of 300 pixels here, meaning that the height and the width of our squares need to be 20 pixels in order to make sure 15 squares fit on a line before being wrapped over themselves to make a second row. We might as well assign a color to future classes we will use of shooter, invader, boom for when the shooter hits an invader, and the laser. Let's open the HTML file path in our browser to check that looks fine. Okay, great. Now let's go to our app.js file. We start off by adding a DOM event listener. All our JavaScript code will go inside this event listener from now on. Now let's pick out the classes and IDs we have defined using query selectors. As there is more than one element that is considered a div inside the element with the class name grid, we need to make sure that to use query selector all for the squares. Also note how we use the hash when we pick out our ID names rather than the dot for class name. Now let's let our JavaScript know that we want the width of the grid to be 15, that we want the shooter to start at index 202 in our squares array, and our invaders to start at index 0, or collectively invaders. I'll explain that later. We are going to leave an empty array for the invaders we have shot down. Let our result be 0 for now, and let the direction we want to go in be a 1. Again, I will explain that later. And finally, let's leave the invader ID as null for now. Now, let's define our alien invaders as how we would want them to appear in our squares array. So by saying these are the indexes we want our alien invader to be in, we can easily see this on our grid by adding a colored class name to them. So let's do this using for each like this. So in the array alien invaders, for each item in the array, we will choose to call invader. I will pass this through our squares and any current index value there might be. So in this case, 0. And then I want to add a class list of invader to that square. We set this at purple as purple in our style sheet, so let's see if that works. Let's flip over to our browser and perfect, it works. Now the best part of this is that we can control all the positions of all the invaders in our alien array thanks to the current invader index. Try this yourself by changing the value from 0 to 5 in your file. Okay, let's do the same for shooter. Flip over to our browser to check, and let's carry on. Now we need to make our shooter move across the grid, but not go up or down. For this, we're going to look at key codes, which are the codes given to the keys on your keyboard. Let's write a function called moveShooter and pass through E for event. Let's start off by clearing the board of the shooter by removing the class name from the shooter's current location, index 202, as we set above. Now, using switch cases, we will make a case for key code 37, or the left arrow on your keyboard, and 39, so the right. So for case 37, if the shooter's current index is divisible by the width, so 15, and leaves a remainder, it's allowed to move left. So for example, if you're in a square with index 30, you will know you're on the very left side of the grid as 30 is divisible by 15, and it does not give you any remainders. As you have no remainder, you cannot move left anymore. That's what we've written. Now for case 39, if the shooter's current index is in a square index where the number is divisible by the width, so 15, and the number is less than 14, then you are allowed to move right. Then, once the above is done, add a class of shooter to the new location of the shooter on the grid. Finally, let's add an event listener for the key down action that triggers the move shooter function each time you put one of the keys we discussed down on your keyboard. Let's check out the browser to see if this has worked. Okay, great. Now let's move on. Let's move the alien invaders from one side of the grid to the other, moving down a row each time. We will now write a function called move invaders that we will put on a time loop. First, as above, let's define our left edge and our right edge using similar logic, but for the alien invaders array. This is trickier as we need to apply the logic to the first item in the array for checking if we're on the left edge, and apply the logic to the last item, so the last alien in our alien invader array, to check if we're at the right edge. If we don't do this, our aliens will just carry on going through and what we see is the right edge and look really weird. So make sure to do that. Okay, so if we are on the left edge and our direction is -1, so I use -1 here because if the alien was to go back one index in our array, it would essentially appear to be going left. So if both these things are true, or we are at the right edge and the direction is currently +1, we want to get a direction value of 15. So it will move down a whole row in our grid. If the direction is already 15, we carry on with the same logic as above. So if you have the left edge, change direction to be positive, else carry on going left by keeping the direction as -1. Now let's move over the alien invader array to move any invaders. Loop over again to add the new direction to all the items in the alien array. And loop over again to add the class of invader to the new location of all the aliens in the array or items. Now let's write some logic that decides if the game is over. If the square in our current shooter has a class name that contains invader and shooter, the game is over. This is because the alien invader has got to the, shooter, as in it's got to the same square. We display the game over in our browser using text content and add a boom class just for fun. We also clear the time interval for the game like this. We also want to make sure that if any of the aliens miss the shooter but reach the end of the grid, the game is over too. We do so by declaring that if any aliens are in the last 15 squares of the grid, the game is over. Now we need to invoke this function every 500 milliseconds like this. Let's see how that looks now. Okay, great. Finally, we need to write a function that allows us to shoot at the alien to try win and gain points. We will do so by passing through an event, or E, through our function shoot. Let's declare laser ID as null and add a new current index for the laser. The current index of the laser will always be the current location of the shooter to start with if we write this. So it's always going to go to the shooter and go poo. These two declarations need to be in only the scope of this function for this to work, by the way. Make sure of that. Now, we will write a function in here called move laser. Very similarly, we remove the laser from its current starting position and square. This time, removing a whole width for it to appear to be moving up our grid. So minus 15 squares. And re-add the laser class later. If the current square the laser is in contains an invader, we do three things. Remove the laser, remove the invader, and add a boom for fun. We only want the boom to appear for a very short time, so we can use a timeout for this and make sure to remove the boom after 250 milliseconds. We then clear the time interval for this like so. Let's make an array of aliens we have taken down like this. By writing this, we are pushing a new item to our Alien Invaders Takedown empty array we declared at the beginning of this video using push. We then add 1 to the result and display this in our browser using text content. Lastly, if the laser is in the very first 15 squares, we want to clear this interval and remove the laser class from the grid. We want all of this to happen when we press the spacebar. Using logic we learnt above, we add an event listener and pass through an event or E for the keycode 32, which is the spacebar on your keyboard. We then pass through the move laser function on a 100 millisecond interval like this. Now that we are counting how many aliens we have taken down, we need to add some code above. Using bang, we are writing here that if the alien takedown array does not include this space, you can add an invader class. This means that we will not be re-adding invaders once they are shot. And finally, we need to write some logic to declare a win. This is simple if the length of our alien invaders taken down array is equal to the length of our alien invaders, we win. This is because we have shot all the invaders. Okay, now let's flip over to play. Okay, I can see it doesn't like my event listener. Let's change this to a switch case, because I know that works. Even though there's only one option in the switch case, I mean, it's gonna work, so I'm just gonna use it. Something else isn't working as the aliens aren't disappearing, but they're reappearing. Okay, we forgot to add a class list here. Oops. And there we have it, your very own Space Invader game. If you have any other questions about the game, please let me know below, and I'll try to get back to you. Thank you. Hi everyone, we are now at game 6 out of 7 of our JavaScript games course. We only have one more grid-based game to make after this until you have 7 fully functioning JavaScript games for your portfolio. In this tutorial, we're going to make Frogger, in which we're going to be looking at every single function that you have learnt before in the previous 5 games. So yeah, if you haven't watched the previous videos, definitely do that now before watching this one. But we are going to be taking them that extra level, so making them do more complicated things. As always, minimal styling. I've gone max 5 minutes doing the styling on this. So Frogger is a simple grid-based game in which you, as the user and Frog, start out at the bottom of the grid and have 2 obstacles to pass to get to your home, which is at the top of the grid-based game. The first obstacle is a road in which little cars are going from one side to the other, and you basically have to avoid them like this. Once you avoid that, there is the second hurdle of the river. This is basically flipped on its head, so instead of avoiding things in it, you have to jump on things in it. So you're gonna have to jump on the logs in the river in order to get to the home. What's cool about this is actually when the frog is on the log, it's gonna have to move with the log until it can jump off. So that's gonna be really fun to build. I'm really excited to walk you through this. So yeah, let's get going. So first, let's set up our project with the correct files in our folder. We have the app.js for our JavaScript, index.html for our HTML code, and style.css for our CSS styling. Let's start with the HTML by adding some HTML boilerplate. We will add a title of Frogger for our project that will not visually render in the browser, but show up on the tab. We next need to link our style sheet using a link tag like this to the correct file using an href, and link our JavaScript file again using source and the correct file name of app.js where we store our JavaScript code. Now we have that, let's do some basic visualization of the grid and add a start and pause button for the game, and an h3 tag letting us know how much time we have left or whether we have won or lost. Let's add the start button and h3 tags too, giving them unique IDs instead of class names. I am also going to hard code the time left to display as 20. Okay, now let's flip over to our CSS file. Add the following styling to make our list of divs in the HTML look like an actual grid. What we are doing here is making the divs wrap over each other using Flexbox. Each div inside the div with a class name grid, we are assigning a height and width of 20 pixels because 180 divided by 9 is 20 and we want a 9 by 9 grid. So now right-click your index.html file to open it in the browser, and this is what we will see. Now let's assign colors to our ending block, starting block, and our frog. Flip back to your HTML file and hardcode these into the 5th div down and the 5th from the bottom. This is what it should now look like in your browser. Okay, now let's add some functionality to the frog that we have hard-coded. Not hard-coded, but we'll add to our HTML using JavaScript. Flip over to your app.js file and add an event listener like this. Okay, all our code will be done in this event listener. Now let's pick out elements from our HTML file using constants and query selectors like this. Note how we use query selector all for the divs inside the div with the class name grid. This is because we want all the divs in there. And also see how we use dot for class names and hashes for picking out IDs. So now if I want to show the frog on my grid, I can simply add the class name of frog to a square in the grid of index 76 using JavaScript like this. Now flip over to a browser, hit refresh, and ta-da! Okay, now add a timer ID and leave it as that for now. This is here for our countdown that we will build later. The first thing we're going to do is make our frog move when you press on your keyboard. For this, you need to know the key codes to your keyboard, up, down, left, and right buttons. You can easily Google all the key codes to your entire keyboard. For now, I'm just going to tell you the key codes for the ones we want. We are going to write the function and pass it through as E, or an event. We are going to remove the frog from whatever current square it is in, and then using events and key codes decide which way the frog is going to go using switch cases. So in this case, if key 37 is pressed, so arrow left on your keyboard, and if the current index is divisible by the width with a remainder, move the frog left one space. Do so for key 38, so the up arrow moving the frog a whole width back, visually displaying as if it was going up one square. Then for key 39 or arrow right, and key 40 or arrow down. And then redraw the frog. On each key press, we also want to check if the frog has done anything that would result in winning or losing. Let's put in these functions that we will write in a bit. So if you try to move your frog now with these functions, it will not work as they do not exist and will break your code. So just bear that in mind. Okay, now let's get to rendering the first obstacle the frog needs to cross. So that will be the road with cars that needs to be avoided. Then the second obstacle, which is a river with some logs, the frogs needs to jump on to cross. You will see here in my finished game that the cars moving left are actually just on a loop being rendered in 3 squares. 1, 2, 3, and then repeat. Same for the cars going right. And even the logs are on this loop, just a loop of 5 squares rendering instead. Go to your HTML and add the following class names to your divs, making sure to start from the 19th div down, or for JavaScript's sake, index 18. And the same for the road, so div 46, but index 45. And now flip over to your CSS file and add some colors so we know what is road, car, river, or log. Now save and refresh the browser. And there we go. We can see a road, a river, some logs, and some cars. Now, back in our JavaScript file, let's write a function that will make all the divs with the class name of car left go left, and the divs of class name car right go right. First, let's pick out these divs from HTML and add that to the top of our project. We might as well add the others too. Now let's write a function called AutoMoveCars. In this function, we will use arrow functions that will allow us to give a name to individual divs from all our divs called cars left and pass them through a function. We will do this using for each. So for each div that has a class name cars left, pass it through a function called moveCarLeft. That will make the div go left, and the same for cars right. Okay, now let's write that moveCarLeft function that technically is just going to re-render 3 divs every second. We will use a switch for this and pass through the car left we get from the function AutoMoveCars. Now let's write the loop for the car moving right on the same logic as above. Now let's do the exact same for the logs, but on a loop re-rendering 5 divs every second. Okay, and now let's write our lose function. So if the time runs out, or is equal to 0, or, so using these two parallel lines means or the square the frog is currently in contains a C1 class name, so car, or L5 class name, so blue indicating river, or L4 class name, which again is a river, it loses. Again, we display the losing message, remove the frog, clear the timer from the countdown, and stop the frog moving. Now the final functionality we need to give our game is make sure that the frog is on the log. So when it's on the log, it moves with the log. So in the river, or if the frog is in the squares with index of bigger than or equal to 27 and smaller to 35, move the frog left. It doesn't matter that we're actually including the river divs in here as well, as the frog automatically loses if it goes in these, so don't worry about that, that's fine. Okay, do the same for the right. Okay, now we need to invoke all the above functions to happen every second. So every second we need to move a car or log, make sure to move the frog if it's on a log, and invoke lose if it's standing in a square that a car is going into. Let's call this function move piece. Note we need to pass lose in there and in our move frog function. If we don't have it here, cars will be able to pass through our frog willy-nilly. You also need to add logic to make our current time go down by 1 every second and update the time left div in our HTML to show this to our user. Finally, we need to pass through the move piece function into a countdown that goes down every second. We do this by adding an event listener to a start button. We will also be making the button double up as a pause button, which is quite cool. So on click, we do an if-else statement. By using set interval like this, we are making sure the move pieces function is invoked every second until the timer ID equals 0. We also want to make sure that the frog can only move when the game has started. So we add in our event listener to start the move frog function we wrote above here. As you can see, something's not working. Let's have a look. It's because I need to use document query select all because we're selecting all the divs. Let's change that here and here. Okay, we need to change this. And there you have it, your very own Frogger game. I hope you like my tutorial. Feel free to comment if you'd like some more information or if I haven't explained something very well. Please do subscribe for more videos. I'm really into making grid-based games at the moment in pure JavaScript, so if you can think of any cool ones, let me know and I'll try have a go at it. Thank you. Hi everyone, and welcome to the last game of the JavaScript Games course. This is actually my favorite game, so we're going to be building Tetris. It's my favorite. It's also the hardest, which is why I obviously left it till last, as we're going to be using every single thing that we learned before, as well as learning a few new things. So a few new things that we're going to be learning are get elements by class name, math, floor, sum, splice, concat, as well as adding background images via JavaScript using style background. For anyone joining us now, I would strongly recommend going all the way back to the beginning and starting from the first game, as we're going to be using functions that I'm not going to go into detail in again. I feel like I've already explained them and it wouldn't be fair on everyone else who's watched from the beginning. So things like query selectors, event listeners, arrow functions, we're not going to be going over that again. So yeah, definitely go back. Tetris is a 1984 video game invented by Soviet engineer Alexei Payetnov. It is a grid-based game that has 7 shapes, or technically tetraminos, that you need to navigate all the way down the grid in order to fill up at the bottom. When you fill up exactly a row, this will disappear, but also give you points. The cool part about this is that the shapes are going to rotate, so we're going to learn how to rotate these shapes in JavaScript, as well as move them down from left and right and so on. The other cool thing that we're going to do is display the shape that's about to come down. So I don't know if you've seen Tetris, but usually there's a grid. But there's also like a little side thing that will display the shape that's literally about to come down after you finish having your go. There is a reason why I saved this game till last. It is pretty hard, so if you're feeling brave, let's get going. For this project, we are going to use a HTML file, CSS file, and a JavaScript file. Make sure to set up your files accordingly. Next, we need to add the following script tag into the head of your HTML file. It will point you to your JavaScript file and your app folder file through the source attribute. Next, add an event listener to your JavaScript file like so. First of all, to make the game, we need to decide on our grid size. For this video, I have chosen 10 squares width by 20 squares height. So from now on, consider each square to be one div on your HTML file. This gives a total of 200 divs on our HTML file. If you flip over to your HTML file, please add a total of 200 divs. Please put these divs in a div itself and give it a class name of grid. For the purpose of teaching, I'm going to give each of these divs a color of yellow in my CSS file and a height and width so we can see them as squares like so. As you can see, because divs are programmed to be in block, this is what happens in our browser. By setting a width to our grid, we can stack the divs from left to right in rows of 10. Obviously, if the width of a div is 20 pixels and the width of the grid is 200 pixels, we will get 10 divs in a row. So feel free to mess around with that as you want. I've numbered them for the sake of the tutorial, like this. Let's have a look at our grid now. Next, we need to use the query selector to add the following into the top of our JS file. Our JS file now knows what we mean by grid by picking up the div with the class name grid from our HTML page. Now that we have our grid set up, let's focus on the tetraminos themselves. In Tetris, there are 5 tetraminos. Tetris in general has a pretty cool backstory, so check it out if you can. Right. Their official names are the L tetramino, Z tetraminos, T tetramino, O tetramino, and I tetramino. As you can see here, I've put them in 4x4 grids to accommodate for their rotational axis. Based on my drawing, we are now able to draw the tetraminos as constants with their 4 rotations, using the constant of width as set above. We have set the width as 10, so let's take the starting position as 0 and start drawing our tetraminos out on the grid, each with their 4 rotations. So let's set this out at the top of your JS file. Now that we have our 5 tetraminos with their 4 rotations, let's put them in an array and call them the tetraminos. As you know, Tetris tetraminos are selected at random. We will now need to write something that will randomly select a tetramino from our tetraminos array. Mathfloor will simply round down the integer that is returned, in this case making sure that it is 1 below the tetraminos array length. Once we have defined random, we need to define the current rotation of the randomly selected tetramino. Let's define this as current. So now we technically have to find what one of the randomly selected tetramino's current rotation is. Let's move on to the next part, moving current down one div space with every second. For this, let's pick the top center of the board as a starting point for the current to drop down from. Let's call this current position. We are now going to visually move the tetramino down by drawing it and undrawing it in divs. For this, we are going to have to assign a class name to the divs we want to visually display a tetramino shape in. So, let's put this at the top of our file. Again, using query selector all this time. Now go to your CSS file and add the following. From now on, all divs with a class name block will be blue. Now, let's write the draw function to give all the squares in your current tetramino the class name block. I've also written some code to give each tetramino a randomly selected color from an array. You can choose this if you want, but we're not going to do it now because it's not really necessary for the game to work. Again, head over to my GitHub if you want to check that out. Right, so now that we've written the draw function, let's write the undraw function. So this will essentially get rid of the class name block from the divs in what we define as current. As you can see, we are using for each, which meaning that each of the squares or divs in our current tetramino will have the class name of block removed from them, like so. Right, now that we've done that, we need to write two more functions. Actually, let's get the move down function out of the way first. So just to speed up moving down. We will do this like so. It simply adds the width to visually display the shape moving down. I have added the freeze function here. I'm adding it so that you know it's necessary to put this in the move down function to stop the current tetramino when it reaches the end of the grid. We will write this function towards the end of the tutorial. If you want to invoke the move down function earlier than this, please take out the freeze function. Okay, now I'm going to write the move right function. A lot is going on here. I'm going to write a reminder that we need the current tetramino to move left if it hits the right edge of the grid. We do not want the tetramino crossing over into the other side of our grid. We also don't want it to go through other frozen pieces. Okay, so function move right goes like this. First we undraw the space, then we define what is the right edge and what happens to the current tetramino when it is in it. Next we write what happens when the shape is not in the right edge, i.e. freeze to move right but adding 1 to the current position. Now finally, if any of the squares in our current tetramino go into a div containing block 2, we also want it to move left, so appearing as if the shape hasn't moved at all. This block 2 is what I've defined as a frozen shape. Finally, we redraw the tetramino. Now go to your CSS file and add a block 2. All our frozen shapes will now appear as purple. Let's do the same for moving our tetraminos left, using the same logic as above. You will notice I use modulus here. This is saying that if our shape has a square in div 10, div 20, div 30, and so on, it is divisible by our set width and leaves a remainder of 0. Remember that we count the first item in our array as 0, so div 10 is actually div 11 in our physically drawn divs in our HTML. Right, so once we've written those, our final function is to rotate the tetramino. This is actually us just skipping to the next rotation in the current rotation array of each tetramino. So again, it's a visual trick, making it look like it's rotated. We write this simply like so. Okay, so now we've written the functions for our move down, move left, and move right, and rotate. We need to assign keys to them and add an event listener. Do this at the top of your JS file. The E here means event, and we need to pass it through the functions like so. Okay, so now we can move the tetramino around on the board and rotate it. Great. We now need to decide what happens if the tetramino with class name block hits the bottom of the board or a frozen tetramino of class name block 2. First, let's decide that the bottom of the board is defined as anything with div class name block 3, right? So we're going to add another block class name. Go back to your CSS file and like before, add the following. Now go into your HTML file and hardcode block 3 as a class name into the last 10 divs. You should see this show up in your browser like so. Great. Okay, now as everyone knows, in Tetris you can actually see the upcoming tetraminos in your game. Let's quickly create this feature by writing a function called display shape and adding some code to our HTML so we can see what's happening. I'm going to use a lot of logic we have used before to make the small grid, a 4x4 grid to display our display squares, even creating a new small tetramino array. Okay, now we can see our display grids above our main grid in the browser. Again, we need our JavaScript to know what we mean when I say using the constant display squares. So we need to add this query selector here. Now, using the same logic, let's write how we are going to see the previous shaped tetraminos in our display squares. We need to set a new width for the small grid. Also a new index. Let's call this display index. Now, just like before, we are going to write out our 5 tetraminos. However, this time we do not need all 4 rotations. We are simply displaying the tetramino. So for this, we only need one iteration of each tetramino in an array. Let's call this constant small tetraminos. And now let's write the function display shape. Again, you might be familiar with how I write this by now. We will also be selecting the small tetraminos at random. Let's put next random at 0 up here. So what is happening is each time the display shape function is evoked, we are removing any class names from divs first, selecting the next random small tetramino, then drawing it out onto our grid. Let's see if it works by invoking the function here. Okay, oops, I made a mistake. This should be query selector all. And yes, with a page refresh, there is our small tetramino in our display grid. Okay, now let's get rid of that and carry on. Now let's go back to the freeze function that I mentioned previously in the move down function. A lot will be happening in the freeze function. We need to freeze the tetramino if any or some of its squares enter with a square containing block 3, so the bottom of our grid essentially, or if the squares enter a div with the class name block 2, so frozen squares. If any of the two above happen, we need to turn all the squares in the current tetramino to block 2 squares. After this happens, we need to make sure the next random tetramino from the display shapes becomes our next current tetramino. And finally, we need to draw the current tetramino by invoking the draw function, and then display the next tetramino in the display grid by invoking the display shape function. Next, we need to put all these things together and create a way for our user to start the game, therefore invoking the draw function and making sure the game continues to move the tetraminos every 1 second as well. We do this by creating a start button in our HTML and adding an event listener like so. For now, set timer ID at null. We will need this to restart the game also. Again, here we need to display a random tetramino from our small tetramino array, like so, and invoke the display shape function we wrote earlier. So now go into your HTML and add a button. And now add the following to your JS file. You will now see in your browser that upon pressing start, the draw function and the display function will be invoked, as well as the timer. Oops, you can see the shapes are falling through the bottom of the floor. This is because there's no freeze function in our move down function. I removed it, as I mentioned earlier in the tutorial, it would have not let me move left, right, up, down on the key codes if that was still in there because we didn't write the function. So yeah, if you got rid of the freeze function from our move down function, as I mentioned, please do put it back in now. If this is not here, then the shapes will simply fall through the bottom of the grid. Okay, now that should work. Perfect. Now go to our HTML page so we can visually show a score and how many lines we have cleared in our browser. I'm going to do this with h1 tags. So as you can see here, we're using class names for our JS files, so we can then use the query selector to make our JS file and HTML file communicate. Let's add the following to the top of our JavaScript file, so score and lines. We are now set to write the game over function in our JavaScript file. I'm going to write it like so. Hopefully by now you're comfortable with how I am using block 2 and block 3 in my functions. It's just the same here. Make sure to clear the timer ID so that no tetranylos carry on falling. And again, we need to add this function into our freeze function. And finally, we can write our add score function. This function will add 10 to our current score each time it is executed or invoked. Let's start by defining a constant row, like this. Next, we need to use every to make sure that if every square in our defined row contains block, i.e. a frozen tetramino, we add a score of 10 and add a line to one of our counts. So our line count. And now we want to display this in our browser. We can do this using inner HTML, like so. Finally, we need to get rid of the row, just like in Tetris, once we have added the score on the line. We will do so using remove. Now to move the removed row down one, we will use splice. Splice will cut out the current index we're at plus our defined width of 10. So in other words, the whole row. Now that's done, we will need to use append child to add a new row to the top of our grid, visually appearing as if nothing got removed or added in the first place. And there you have it, my game of Tetris. As mentioned, this is my first video